Welcome back. We're going to talk about Trump in this segment. But before we do that, I said Tembiso can hold because she's been holding for quite some time. Tembiso, what do you have in mind?
Hi, Dr. Ndlozi.
Yeah.
I find it in my podcast.
Come again?
I missed your lecture yesterday.
Oh, you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah, I should be looking for it. Yeah, everyone seems to be talking about it, so it's supposed to be pretty good.
No, thanks. What do you have in mind this morning?
I want to talk about the tribunal, Judge Mbuyiseni, the Judicial Services Commission, where they're disciplining a judge for sexual harassment. I heard something very concerning yesterday from the evidence leader, who is advocating that she brings a gender and or power expert, and she names the person she found, who happens to be a white woman, and the expert who does not have skills or training, she's not a feminist scholar, she's not a gender scholar, and she's also not a social scientist scholar, so she's not going to be understanding theories, of power, as it were. And then she says it took her time to find this expert. Basically she could not find black experts. She could only find this one person. And it took them time to get this person on board because this person wanted surety that she would be paid. And she even withheld her basic comments, opinion, because she wanted to be paid, and for some reason, the OCJ has managed to get a contract for her, and they've committed that they would pay her. And that concerned me because I thought, well, each and every university has a school of gender studies and social scientists. There are many feminist scholars, who are black and capable. Why this particular one? And then the question is, wow, so she would not touch this work unless she is paid. Did they advertise this tender? How did it go? And it just goes back to saying, why, are white women analyzing our stories of violence, and why are they paid for it? So, it really concerns me. Yeah.
Hey.
And I'm hoping the CGE will follow up on it because I tried calling them yesterday and didn't take my call.
When you do get a hold of them, please get back to us.
I will do so, because, it comes across as injustice because, I was, thinking that, isn't it, is this tribunal not going, the direction of the Omotoso case? Because the advocate on the other side, he was quite categorical, basically snatched, this particular expert, witness, and I was thinking, you're actually right, although it's a feminist, I shouldn't be saying that, you're actually right, and the problem is probably not, this particular expert. She's a capitalist, who's making money out of black women's, misery, but the problem seems to be the OCJ.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tembiso. Thank you.
I will do so.
Thank you.
I'll be in touch with you, your producer, once I get them.
Thank you very much. Tembiso, they're always provocative indeed. President Donald Trump and Ndlozi has now targeted pharmaceuticals. I'm joined by Kanti Pai, the PwC senior economist, to speak about this question of taking down the prices of pharmaceutical drugs, the drugs that, not pharmaceutical drugs, prescription drugs with the pharmaceutical companies. Kanti, welcome to Power Talk.
Very good to talk to you, Doc, and good morning to your listeners.
Thank you very much indeed for creating time there by PwC. The Price Water Coopers. Yeah. What do you make of this, Kanti? What does it mean?
It's very difficult, to follow. But I was listening to President Trump talking about the pharmaceutical tariffs, and one of the things he mentioned was that he was talking to his friend, who told him that, he says, he's got this very big friend, and the friend told him that he's buying a particular drug in the UK for a tenth of the price that is available in the UK, and so, in the US, and so he's responding to that, there is a level of unfairness in terms of all of this. It's an interesting thing, of course, because obviously the pricing of drugs, as we know in South Africa, we've been fighting this fight for a very long time. Is a very complex situation that really obviously has required transformation for a very long time, and people have said that there's a need to look into the pricing of drugs, especially, and I think as basically the President Trump puts it, that some of the research is borne by the public at least, and there's a big part of the research that is borne by the public, whether it's in universities or grants and so on and so forth. So it seems that he's leading towards a conversation around, as he's been saying, America is being abused globally, and he's going to end the abuse of America. But it's not very clear, though, that actually it is true that medicines are most expensive in the U.S.
But what are they looking at? Because, firstly, for the benefit of the listeners, just a basic explanation of what President Trump is seeking to do. And then secondly, what could have sort of provided or served as evidence of the conclusion that the drugs are most expensive in the U.S.?
Well, he doesn't use any evidence. So I think we must start there. And I think we know with the tariff discussion, he's always obviously been saying that there's unfairness to America, that all of us who are exporting to the U.S. are punishing the U.S., and U.S. is subsidizing the rest of the world through actually the deficits that it runs. And he has not provided evidence. I think there was those where he actually tried to sort of give us calculations of how they calculate these reciprocal tariffs that he's put up, which basically where he says, he is reciprocating to the unfairness of the world to the U.S. or the substantial trade deficits that the U.S. has. He's putting up these tariffs, but the calculation itself was widely seen as actually one that is fallacious. So one of the key things here is to also obviously ask the same question. Is it true that, medicines are most expensive in the U.S.? And the truth, there's very little evidence that he has presented in that. So he does not present much evidence. As I say, when he explains how he got to this conclusion, he said that a friend of his was buying one of these drugs that had been used for obesity, and his friend claimed that this was it. So whether or not that claim is not evident, but there was a doctor who came on his platform citing that drugs. But it is important to note though that various drugs cost various things in different countries, depending on a number of considerations. Certainly, where the drug is being manufactured is important. There's also other considerations around negotiations that are held. Then, of course, there's also issues around what the particular country will add into taxes or into profits. So in South Africa, for example, we know we've got something called the single exit price. It's something that was quite discussed quite a long time ago. It's a regulation that the government says, that you can only pay this kind of price at this amount into the drug retail price, and that's what we have. So certainly it's a big debate, but whether or what President Trump is looking to do is not very clear, but it may very well be part of the discussions that he has, is purposed by the same kind of imagination he's used across since he started as president in terms of thinking about pricing really of goods and services across the board, including last week, the week before's announcement that he would tax all movies or all movies that are not produced in Hollywood by 100% more. So those are the kinds of discussions that I think are prevailing there.
But there has been a sort of enduring problem in the United States. Certainly, most of the presidents from the Democratic Party have decried the price of prescription drugs. And this has served partly as an argument for Obama's healthcare program. It is indeed a thing. I'm not sure whether it's unique to the U.S., but certainly some of the people welcoming this conversation, welcoming this posture by Donald Trump, argue that it's something Democrats have been threatening to do, which they haven't done. Isn't it true, though, that the prices of prescription drugs in the United States are unbearable?
Yes, there's no doubt. I mean, the prices of health in general in the U.S. are unbearable, especially because also there isn't much of a public sector. So there's not much of a public sector in terms of, so the deregulation of the health sector is a particularly, big impact on drugs, because the public sector plays very little, has played very little in terms of price determination of drugs, unlike, as I said here. So the deregulation part is a big contributor to that, because obviously unregulated markets sometimes tend to have these kinds of side effects. So Donald Trump is probably responding to that. So there has certainly been that. We also know that health in particular is particularly expensive in the U.S. Again, not regulated, as opposed to where in regulated markets, where obviously in South Africa you find that the government plays an important part in the sector, where there is a public sector, there's a private sector, there are regulations as to pricing of medication, and the government is particularly participating in training and all sorts of things and research. So there's certainly in the U.S. the involvement of government in that sector, when you don't have public sector hospitals, and one of the things we're talking about is the unregulated prices of medicine. But one of the other key things, of course, is that if there is no regulations, of course, private sector players will then, and of course, it is not one of the most competitive areas, because entry, the barriers to entry in that market are quite high. So it's not one that you can speak of as highly competitive, so that you could actually see competitors coming in and actually bringing down prices where there is that those people who are able to enter the market are able to obviously continue to drive supernormal profit. So this has been something obviously of certainly of very, very, very clear contestation. But it does highlight the importance, of course, of thinking about, when you think about the term regulation, the importance of regulation to protect consumers, and certainly the discussion that we've had around universal access to health care and other considerations that are important to think about in terms of government being engaged in goods that are important for access to ordinary people.
This executive order is very powerful. I mean, I didn't know that it could do so. Certainly in terms of the things that a state, a government, particularly in the US, can do with regards to price regulations relates to mechanisms like the tariffs. I didn't know that you can, as an executive head of state, come out through the executive order and say, from today, the price of bread in the US will be the same as in South Africa. What is this? Can you help us understand? Because in this case, it's not the evocation of a tariff policy as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Look, I mean, this is the thing that has been debated in the U.S., and I think it is something that I think many economists are actually going to engage on in terms of actually lawmaking in the U.S., because that's something that's obviously of critical importance when you are considering the risk that you are taking on in any country. Is, in South Africa, people always talk about the issue of South Africa's the policy. I forget the word, but that South Africa's policies are not predictable, and that that causes a lot of risk, and that every time South Africa,
yes, particularly for foreign direct investment.
So exactly. So we hear a lot of that, and that's because people sort of want to feel that there's a process of making laws, and that process of making laws is maybe inclusive, but it can also be predictable. It clearly seems in the US that system that does not work, or at least. From what we can see here, and I think we've seen members of the legislature, members of Congress, very clearly coming out and saying, actually, this guy is making rules where he was allowed executive orders in cases where there is an emergency. So he needs to urgently deal with something that would take a little bit more time if he were to actually take it to Congress or to the legislature. So in that sense, he is probably exercising powers he should not be exercising in the manner that he is exercising them, but that's still up for challenge. But certainly, this idea is very unsettling, because I think a lot of people are learning that the safe haven the U.S. has been for trade, for investment, is now actually become very, very, very unsettled, because that the president can actually do this without any warning, without any engagement, without any participation of the public, of political representatives, and certainly not, consumers or anybody else who may be interested as a stakeholder in those kinds of conversations. And so it is one that stands for scrutiny as time goes by, to say, look, clearly one needs to actually look very closely at those kinds of regulations and how safe U.S. as a market is, in terms of how, for a long time, people have believed in the U.S. market is one of the safest, because it seemed that it was more predictable, but it clearly is not as predictable, and that the excesses of this administration doesn't mean that they cannot be transferred to the next until we see some changes. But really, as you say, the idea that a president can single-handedly, one individual, do that kind of thing is very unsettling.
Well, I mean, I think with regards to this move, some of these moves are very welcome. You're thinking, pharmaceutical companies are fundamentally exploitative, and they maximize with regards to their pricing mechanisms. And in a situation precisely like this one, where there is less regulation of that market, certainly you do have sympathy with this kind of a move. But I just want to ask about the implications for the sort of global pricing, the implications on the global market. I mean, I'm thinking here, let us say hypothetically, are there situations, let me put it that way, where a company in the United States that sells drugs sells at this high price to the US market and does the opposite in a different market, whether in Europe or Africa? And what would be the implication in this case for the executive order?
Well, look, certainly it's not clear whether or not this is it's something that is caused by pharmaceutical companies themselves, or the manufacturers themselves. So, for example, it's entirely possible to import drugs, say, from India, where they are being manufactured, and then sell them in the U.S. market, particularly at those prices, because we can. The market is open and unregulated. There's certainly been work that's been done before, but I think it actually does show that U.S. prices are slightly, or in some areas, actually fundamentally higher than other areas globally. But that might be something that is left really spoken to around whether it is actually a particularly United States market kind of thing, because obviously, as I said earlier, this market is unregulated and it's quite complex because of the structure of the health system itself. So that is something else. But whether or not it's not driven by the competitive forces, as many of us would actually understand as it's supposed to be. But it's also, obviously, if we think about health itself, is that it's one of the areas we would not want to entirely leave to market forces without government coming in to correct for market failures, especially for access to poor people and those kinds of things. So there's no doubt that the U.S. is in a position of review across many areas, of course, as President Trump actually forces us to rethink a lot of things that are happening in the U.S. But one of the key areas, is that the drug manufacturers will definitely come out and really, and the retailers will come out and speak for themselves in the U.S. and say, look, this is how we've actually priced, this is what has been happening, and that might be something that is important for President Trump to do. This step on its own is not particularly helpful, because it does not actually reach to the core of the problem. It's arbitrary in the sense that even as it puts in the cuts, as he's cutting, he's not actually following any particular science. He's not actually putting any particular case.
But could they go to court, for instance, that maybe is violating their rights to free trade, or what is the power of the executive order? If they don't implement it, what can Trump do? Shut them down? And do they have any recourse as companies?
Yes, sure. I think like all of the executive orders which have been challenged in different areas, that he has put in, so the courts have in many instances spoken against some of these executive orders where they have been challenged by affected parties, or stakeholders. So certainly it is reviewable in the courts. That's something that he can do. As I said, and as you rightly say, if they don't comply, of course, it's something that he obviously is now an executive order, so that he can actually make those orders as you can see as policy, and they actually become permanent. So certainly the pharmaceutical industry has every opportunity to go and review these and put it in front of court and say this is not right. As can different parties that are engaged or interested or have an interest that can be shown in this kind of thing. As you have seen with other executive orders that have been reversed by courts in the U.S. for the same reason, which I guess is the one area that, as I was talking earlier about, the security and the insecurity of the U.S. market and the quite difficult that the courts have seen quite resilient, and we're able to, the judiciary has been able to hold its court to be able to actually keep that review mechanism quite possible, much like we see in South Africa, as many people usually say.
Khanti Payi, PwC senior economist. Thanks indeed for joining us and creating time to speak through these matters of pharmaceutical industry pricing of prescription drugs. And it's 10:30 here on Power Talk with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. We're going to take the headlines with Nyakalotefu. Stay tuned.